Hello, Yakri here with another Dominions 5 video. This time we're on part 2 of my series on different blesses in Dominions. Before we get started, I wanted to make a couple quick notes. One was in the previous video I mentioned fire shields being AP 6 damage. They are actually only armor piercing 5 damage, which means that they are slightly worse than I was already evaluating them as. Someone else mentioned that heat auras also set people on fire. I thought I mentioned that, but I may not have. So if I didn't, heat auras can set people on fire. I believe it is an effect of high temperature scales, right? High heat scales in a province, like because the different temperature auras, heat, cold related auras, chill aura, and heat aura have bonuses when you are in heat and cold 3. And I think it scales linearly, right? Like if you're in heat 1, cold aura doesn't do as much, and in cold 1 it does more, and then in cold 3, of course, it does the most. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Also, the different survival skills like wasteland survival, swamp survival will reduce the supplies used by your troops. If you don't know, if your troops use too many supplies because you have a large army in a given province, then they will get diseased, which is pretty bad, and your army will slowly die off and develop afflictions. So you don't want that. It's still very situational. I think most of my comments about the different survival blesses apply still, but it's something to keep in mind that there's that added benefit that you can potentially make use of when the circumstance presents itself. So now we're going to talk about water and earth blesses. So a lot of the first couple things in here, or like just the whole first 4 things in here, I've pretty much previously covered, or there's an equivalent that I've covered, right? So minor cold resistance, major cold resistance, no need to talk about those. Same deal as with other resistances. Winter's Gift is the same as the various survival skills, but for snow provinces, right? You do have reduced movement in snow provinces. It can be quite handy if you're going cold scales. Swamp survival, same as the other survival skills, but for swamp, or survival blesses, but for swamp. Water walking, a little bit more notable, it only lets you cross rivers, which, is still handy. Something to keep in mind that it's only handy in the summer. If you have cold scales, the rivers freeze and you can walk over them. Let's see, and that gets us up to defense skill. So, defense skill is very handy. In general, it's more handy on high defense units than it is on low defense units in general, because if your unit has like 6 defense and you boost it up to 8, on balance, they're probably still going to be hit by weapons from a average infantry unit, right? Because they're going to have about attack skill 10 or a little bit higher. So it's not that useful, right? But if your unit is already in the range where they're not going to get hit normally, they have like defense skill 16, and you give them an additional +2, it keeps them farther out of the range of potentially being hit. It protects them from more attacks per turn because you get, of course, the harassed penalties as you're attacked more, reducing your defense. It's particularly good on cavalry units because cavalry units only take -1 to their defense for each time they've been attacked in a turn, whereas foot units take -2 per attack they've managed to avoid in a turn, right? I think it's attacks that they've received. Actually, it doesn't matter if you dodge it, I don't think. So the defense skill is pretty good on already high defense units, where you can get more value out of it, where it actually relates to missing attacks most of the time. Of course, you can stack this if you were to take water 6, but I don't see much reason to do more than 1 point of defense skill, right? It's kind of a splash bless where you might go say defense skill in Winter's Gift, for example, in addition to some other bless, right? Maybe if you wanted to pick up water magic on your pretender, investing 6 points for it, probably not worth it, even on units that could really use it, because you could go whole hog and invest 7 points and say a awe bless instead. And you could get more out of that in terms of relative benefits to your defense, actually, because of how it prevents units from attacking you. Although, of course, defense skill is very flexible in that for any attack made in melee combat, it's potentially useful, right? Of course, very, very high attack bonus units may make it kind of a moot point, but those are quite rare. There's not a lot of good ways to boost the attack of units. if they're not sacreds and you're not like giving them bonus attack skill or blood surge or something. So, yeah, moving on. Frost weapons. Frost weapons are interesting. They're probably not as useful as fire weapons because, for example, flaming weapons on balance can deal damage against Prot 10 units most of the time. Frost weapons on balance should not actually deal damage to Prot 10 units most of the time because it's 8 regular cold damage, not armor piercing, not armor negating, just damage. Now, what this does mean is that frost weapons will be exceedingly effective against units that do not have high protection. It'll cut through, things like Stygian skin very effectively on units that needed it because they had very low protection. It'll ignore things like Fortitude because that's slashing, piercing, and blunt resistance, and this is frost damage. So, there's a variety of cases where this would actually be good. I'm not familiar if the frost damage has any bonus effect. I'm not aware of one. I don't think the fire damage from flaming weapons has a bonus effect either, unless a unit has fire weakness. So likewise, if a unit has cold weakness, this is going to be very effective, as it's going to deal bonus damage to them and probably be able to get past their armor. So this is good for like if your sacreds have pretty low damage and you expect to use them on like chaff units, right? Then this could be a relatively huge boost to their damage. And of course, it also makes your weapons magical, and it has all the benefits of that. I feel like it's not as good as flaming weapons, though, probably, and maybe not as good as thunder weapons. But there is one thing, which is it only costs 5 points, which is very cheap. So keep that in mind. Chill Aura, same deal as with Fire or Heat Aura, except that Chill Aura can freeze units, right? If units are frozen, they can't attack you. Heat Aura can light people on fire, but the thing is that they take time to burn to death, and they can attack you while they do it. So a Cold Aura, it gives you a lot more benefit in terms of durability, right? It gives you a way to kind of disable enemy units before they've been fatigued out by the fatigue damage. I think this is more viable than Heat Aura, probably, as both an Army Bless tool and a Thug Bless tool. I don't know if I necessarily think it's a good option. You probably need to be, or really want to be fighting in the correct scales for it, which is to say you want to be fighting in cold, preferably like your own Dominion Cold 3, and versus nations that are invading you, who hopefully do not have cold resistance, right? Because if you invade another cold nation, they probably have cold resistance, and this is not a great ability, since it's basically useless versus anyone with cold resistance, so keep that in mind. Overall, not one of my favorite bless options, but I think it's in the realm of definite usefulness, right? And I'm not sure Heat Aura is so much so. Well, of course, almost any of these are potentially useful, actually, with like really rare exceptions like Farshot. But there's a big difference between like viable, like worth the points useful, and like I could just throw this on for the hell of it and useful, right? Like shock, what was it? Charged body, right? Terrible. This is definitely better than charged body, but I'm not sure it's quite worth the point investment. Water breathing, 7-point bless lets you go underwater basically. Like you can cross rivers too, but really entering the sea, that's the big deal here. And now this is like with all of the utility in where you can go blesses, or how fast you can get there. The advantage to this is that you can actually invade water provinces without going into any sort of magical items or casting a huge enchantment to do so. But the downside is that this is a very large point investment, and it does not get you any additional combat capabilities. So I would be comfortable in taking this to send my sacreds in to do battle against indie provinces. But if you're going in against an actual water nation, they'll probably obliterate you. If this is like your tool, so you can only bring in your sacreds, you can't really splash this in addition to some other powerful bless very easily. it's definitely a situation where like I could see you putting your sacreds into the ocean with this and taking out indie provinces. But you can also do that with some expansion pretenders or some thugs. There are a lot of other ways to accomplish the same thing that might be, quite frankly, more cost effective. But potentially it's useful. You know, there could be thrones in the water. And if there aren't any water nations, and you have this bless, and you could unexpectedly march into the sea, take a throne that's in the sea, and that could be quite worth it, as that could win you the game, right? So, something to keep in mind, particularly if you're going deep into water anyway on your pretender for whatever reason. There, unfortunately, is not a very large number of good reasons to do that, but suppose you were, then this could be a good pickup if you don't expect your sacreds to be super important, since water is very lacking in valuable mage blesses. Alright, so Quickness, this is like the capstone of water. Unfortunately, I'm not very enthusiastic about it in Dominions 5. Yes, it's a very good ability, attacking twice as fast. Borderline makes your sacred units twice as useful, particularly for units with more attacks. It really gets magnified, like a unit with 3 attacks now has 6 attacks in a given period of time, right? So that's very handy. Moving twice as quickly makes your ground infantry almost as fast as cavalry, and it makes your cavalry absurdly fast. They just dart to the back of the battlefield, and you get +2 to attack and +2 to defense on top of that. It's very good. So this is a really powerful bless. The thing is that it's commensurately costly at 10 water bless points. That's hugely expensive for what you get. Now, I'm not going to say there aren't nations that can make use of it. However, when you've got options like Awe, Flaming Weapons, Blood Surge, and Regeneration, like it can be a lot more cost effective to get a major bless, minor bless like Awe and Blood Surge than to get just Quickness, right? So, because 10 points is very, very high for each magic path point you go up, like the cost is going to be higher than the last point pretty significantly. And getting all the way to 10, very expensive. And keep in mind, you're going to want this on an Awake Pretender. And so in Dominions 5, you have this balance where you want a powerful bless, if you're a bless nation, on an Awake Pretender, but you also want some scales. You have to tank your scales a lot harder than you would have had to in Dominions 4. And so the really high cost here is a very big limiting factor. I do think there are some nations that can take it as an option, but it's dependent on what pretenders you get access to, because you need a good chassis to make taking a water 10 bless less expensive, and you need a nation that can tank more of their scales, right? Like going into Turmoil probably needs to be an option for you. Going into Sloth probably needs to be an option for you. Going into Drain probably needs to be an option for your nation if you want to take this bless, because it's so freaking expensive. Now, I will say there's like the particular type of unit that will get a lot of benefit out of this are sacreds that are probably good even without a bless, right? Like really, really powerful sacreds, particularly of the type that don't just survive for a long time. The kind of units that have multiple attacks, they have decent armor, they've got decent hit points, and so that you can, without giving them much more survivability, you can slap this on them and make them murder through the battlefield extremely quickly. And also they have to be units that don't suffer too much from fatigue, because you take fatigue when you make attacks, and they'll be making more attacks with this bless. Excuse me. So let's move on to Earth Magic. So, Mountain Survival, same dealio as other survivals. It is a little bit cheaper than most, but that's probably also because mountains are a little less bad to pass over than most, I want to say. Swamps and wastelands, you get the extra benefit of those places having terrible supply problems, and so that little actual survival bonus is a little bit more handy in those cases. But shrug, it's not a bad pickup for at one point. It's not a bad pickup really, if you had a spare earth point somehow, but you probably won't. The reason being is because reinvigoration is super duper duper good, +1 reinvigoration per turn, so that means you restore 1 fatigue to your units per turn, which is a time unit in combat, And in particular, this is really good for mages because mages need fatigue to cast spells. Now, in a really long battle, your mages are going to hit 100 fatigue, pass out, eventually heal up while they're resting in unconsciousness, back to below 100 fatigue, and then cast spells again. Now, reinvigoration, the more of it you have, the faster this process is going to go, and the longer it's going to take before they hit that 100 fatigue limit, because they're going to be getting fatigue restored as they march towards it. This is just a super good ability for mages. Now, it's also very good for heavily armored troops, because once you hit 50 fatigue, you start taking severe penalties, your protection is half as valuable, and that's when heavily armored troops tend to just explode, right? So if you make sure your heavily armored troops never get to that point during battle, then they're much more valuable to you. So keep this in mind. Reinvigoration is just very valuable in general. It's one of the reasons Blood Surge is so good, because even on mages, if they're actually killing people with their spells, they'll get an extra 1 reinvigoration, even though the combat portions of the Bless aren't useful. And 1 reinvigoration on a lot of melee sacreds is enough to substantially increase the time until they hit a nasty level of fatigue. I believe you also take fatigue penalties in a more granular fashion as you increase in fatigue, all the way from 1 to 100, but I can't recall what they might be off the top of my head. Probably there are certain breakpoints where you get more penalties to attack and defense and whatnot. So that's why reinvigoration is good, and I don't know if we really need to cover it in any more detail. This is very worth it for 2 earth points, and take it when you can. It's really valuable for a mage bless. It's good. As long as you don't have a more important goal in mind for your Earth Bless points. Reconstruction. So this is one of those things where it's just very specific. If for some reason you want to have sacred units that are statues or something, and you want them to recover from damage over time, you gotta take it. For example, this could be part of a strategy with Middle Age Agartha, but probably not. Probably the changes to blesses in general just mean you don't take a bless on them at all. But yeah, so it's specifically for making never heals units heal. Otherwise, obviously there's no use. Strength of Earth. This is pretty good. So let's talk about strength blesses now, since we've gotten to one. And the deal with strength blesses is that they are going to add damage to your unit's attacks, right? Versus the magic bonus damage blesses, which are like their own separate side damage instance, right? So increasing the physical damage of your units has some advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that things like mist form, things like invulnerability will work against it. The things like Fortitude will work against it. But the advantage is that blunt, piercing, and slashing actually have some pretty good special aspects to them, right? Piercing ignores 20% of protection, blunt deals double damage on headshots, slashing has a greater chance of severing a limb, which is very handy when you're fighting people. So higher strength bonus is quite good, and in particular, if you want to beat like a specific threshold, right? Bumping up your strength can be worth it. For example, like I mentioned with frost weapons, for example, it's a really good example. At 8 damage on average, they aren't going to deal damage against units with 10 protection. Well, if you have sacreds that have like 18 damage per hit, right? On average, they will deal damage to units with up to 18 armor. And then if you bump that up by 2, it changes how much protection you need to usually not take damage from these units, right? And so you're basically just pushing up the curve of your average damage, and you push it up high enough and you're going to be able to get past pretty much any kind of armor. Like you take Strength of Earth once and Blood Surge once, that's plus 5 strength, that's 5 additional damage. It's pretty good on a lot of units, right? Probably reasonably, if you really wanted to go all in on strength, you could get at least like 7, 8, 9 additional damage, I'd say, about from strength, and at that point you'd have a lot of units hitting for like 30 something damage, or just shy of 30 damage, and that's at the point where protection can't protect you really from these attacks, which is very handy. So for those reasons, I kind of like it. I like that it adds on to damage. It's particularly good for units with multiple attacks, just like any sort of attack steroid. And in particular, because it comes in smaller bite-sized chunks, it tends to be a lot cheaper than, say, purchasing flaming weapons. So I'm a big fan of strength boosts. However, I'm not sure I like Strength of Earth that much. Not because it's bad, but because it's Earth points, and you could spend them on Reinvigoration, which is very handy. And Earth has some decent options later on, like Hard Skin and Fortitude as well. So, let's see. Yeah, overall, I am a fan of Strength. Keep in mind now that Strength also benefits archers and thrown attacks, right? So, like if you have javelins, if you have bows, if you have slings on your sacreds, it's quite useful. It works for crossbows as well. Of course, I believe it's like 1/3 or 1/4 of strength, so just +2 strength isn't enough to benefit you if you're already at an even number of... just +2 isn't going to benefit you in and of itself, but it may push you over the next, like, break-even point, right, where you get an extra point of damage to your ranged attacks. Yeah. And most units do have an even number, even number for their strength. So it probably will add 1 more damage to your ranged attacks. Yeah. Okay. So moving on. Unbreakable reduces the chance to get afflictions. This is really nice. This is also baked into regeneration already, and so getting a separate ability for 4 points that just reduces the odds of afflictions is honestly pretty underwhelming, because protecting your units from damage reduces the odds of afflictions as well. Because they can only get afflictions when they take damage. So instead, you could get Hard Skin, you could get Fortitude, you could get Quickness, you could get Defense Skill, you could get Awe, you could get Regeneration. I'm not a huge fan of this ability. I think it's probably not useful at all. Yeah. Theoretically, not getting afflictions is useful. It's just that compared to other options that effectively do the same thing, why would you ever get this? That's my question. All right, so for 5 Earth points, Fire and Shock resistance. So this is 2 major resistances for 5 points, which is a fairly decent bargain. 6 points of stuff for 5 points. Not bad, but it is Incarnate, so you have to have an Awake God to benefit from it immediately. It's not terrible. If you had some reason to expect to need it, it's not a bad idea. This is a potential option to go with Death Explosion for some shenanigans. Probably not like competitive play versus other players viable, but if you took this with Death Explosion, generally the Death Explosion won't cause any chain reactions because you'll be able to resist 10 fire damage. So that's an advantage to this, and as opposed to taking major fire resist, which would actually be, I think, similarly or more expensive, because you would have to go like past the cost of Death Explosion, like Fire 8, right? So that's what's the reason you might do this. It would also protect you from charged bodies, so you could do like a little trifecta there. The thing is that spending all these points just to negate the severe drawbacks from those abilities probably doesn't make them worth it. As far as combat goes, this is not bad for thugs, I feel like. Because lightning and fire and air have really good evocations, and you have good reason to suspect that your units will get burned or shocked at some point, right? So there's a good chance that this will protect your units from damage. So I would consider it, particularly if you expect your sacreds or your thugs to encounter a nation that's going to use those evocations, which is a lot of them, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them. So yeah, bear that in mind. I feel like the Earth has some really good other options. In particular, just spending more points in reinvigoration is very good. And it's hard to justify fire and shock resistance over that a lot of the time. But it's not a bad ability. I don't know. I think I'll have to play more games before I decide if I really like it or not. But it is, like I mentioned, it is 6 points of stuff for 5 points effectively in the new system. It's probably worthwhile. Yeah. But I'm not sure it's a good idea to spend bless points on these kind of semi-specific counters versus using some in-game option to counter fire and shock spells, right? But I don't know. It could be worth it. It could be worth it. It would make your nation, in particular, like what I'm thinking is, air magic evocations like thunder strike spam and stuff is very, very strong, and it wouldn't prevent your sacred units from being killed by thunder strikes, not on its own, but it would protect you from the stun damage. It would protect you from other battlefield magic that does less damage than thunder strike, things like orb lightning, things like lightning bolt, things like I can't remember what it is, but there's one like battlefield wide shock spell later on, but that I believe does fairly low damage per hit, right? But you spam it and eventually kill an army. So it'll protect you from things like that, which if you expect to have trouble with one of the air nations, then it's very handy indeed. And perhaps in early age in particular, when you've got like Abyssia potentially breathing down your neck, and maybe you also have to deal with some air nations, yeah, it's a pretty good pickup, right? Lanka exists, Calum exists, All right, it's probably not that bad. But we move on from that to something which is definitely that bad, and that is larger, right? So you're paying 5 Earth Bless points, 3 Nature Bless points. That's fucking 8 points. Now, we can't say it's quite as costly as an actual 8 point of one type Bless, because going up to 8 in a path is very expensive. As it gets more expensive per point you have to go up. However, the thing is that larger is arguably a penalty that you opt to take. Right? You're spending all these points to make your units worse. Why is that? Well, it's kind of complicated. But basically, squares in the Dominion's battlefield map consist of 6 slots. They've got space for 6 size worth of units, right? So if you have size 2 units, you can fit 3 of them in a square, right? Makes sense? The thing is, this makes your units larger size, so you can fit fewer of them in a square. For example, if you boost size 3 units to size 4, now only one of them can be in the same square as his compatriots, right? What this means is that it's easier for your units to get surrounded, right? Because more squares can surround them. They have fewer people in their square. So like if you have size 1 units, right? You can have up to 6 units in a square. These size 1 units are actually what you really would love to have. You'd love most of your units to be size 1, except in the face of battlefield evocation that targets squares, right? Because if someone casts like Bone Melter, that's 1 square AoE, so if you've got 6 units in the square, you're going to be really sad. But for the most part, you would like to have more units in the square. Why is that? Well, because if someone's attacking into that square, there's more people for them to target, right? And if someone's attacking into that square and your units in that square have decent length weapons, like length 4 or 5, and they're longer than the weapons of the person attacking into it, each of those units gets to make a repel attempt to stop them from attacking, right? So low size 2 and size 1, I don't know if there are any size 1 spearmen in the game that you can like just nationally recruit. Probably aren't, but wait, are Vadi size 1? There might be. But size 1 spearmen, if you had access to them, would be very, very nice to have, like with length 4, length 5 weapons, because a square of 6 spearmen is very likely to repel incoming attacks. So larger, for the most part, just makes your unit get surrounded more easily. It's very expensive for what it does, like 30% more HP, in like the best case is something like 18 bonus hit points, right? Yeah, because like you have a 60 HP unit, right? You get 18 bonus hit points. But compared to other similarly costed things, I'm not sure that something like Stygian Skin doesn't give you more than 18 effective HP over the course of a fight, right? This is 18 extra HP. If you combined it with regeneration, that might be valuable, except it costs 3 fucking nature magic, so you're gonna need 10 in nature as well if you want to get regeneration with this. So it's completely unreasonable cost-wise, and it's probably worse for your units to have this blessed than it is for them to have no bless at all in many cases. Particularly like human-sized units that go up from size 2 to size 3, so you can have only 2 people in a square instead of 3 people in a square, and they're only going to gain like 3 hit points from this. This is fucking terrible for those units. So only on size 5... Yeah, only because it doesn't work on size 6 units. I don't know if Needful Giants are even size 6. I think non-gods are size 5 or less, right? So that shouldn't be a problem. But only on giants, and even then, it's probably not worth it, right? You just don't get that much benefit. Plus 3 strength on those types of units is not very good. Although at least on lethal giants being size 6 is not such a big deal because if you're already size 5, the only thing that can fit in a square with you is like a size 1 unit, right? So you're not going to be that much more surroundable, just since you're kind of maximally surroundable already. But even then, 18 effective HP, probably not worth it for this high of a cost. If this was cheaper, maybe this would be a just for giants bless, but I think it's a just for fucking no one bless, unfortunately. Okay, so hard skin. This is really handy. +5 natural protection is pretty good. How to put it? Something you should keep in mind is it doesn't actually add natural protection on top of your natural protection, like it says it does, in the sense that it does not stack with, say, bark skin. I assumed it would initially when I did one of my other videos, and nope, it does not. And so I assume it means it does not stack with any other bonuses to natural protection, just whatever natural protection you actually naturally have. So this is useful for units with like 4 or 5 natural protection and higher, right? Because there are units out there with like 15 natural protection, 7 natural protection, where this is going to be much more useful than bark skin or Stygian skin in terms of increasing your durability. Because it's a protection bonus, I'm a big fan of it, because protection bonuses in general, as they are direct damage reduction versus any or even some magical attacks, actually, because not all magical damage is armor negating. But versus any attack that is not armor negating, protection is damage reduction, and damage reduction is like the best form of damage prevention you can have for the most part. With some caveats like awe, in a situation where awe actually works, right, where you have not super morale units that are fighting you in melee, that's probably better than 5 more protection. But for the most part, protection is like the best way you can increase the toughness of your units. So it's a very good bless, and it's 6 points, yeah. So it's fairly cost effective as well. Fortitude. So Fortitude is good to stack with other toughness boosting blesses. Obviously magic damage will slip by this, but all basic melee weapons, all basic projectiles are going to be reduced in damage by half by this ability. I believe it reduces your damage after protection by half. I might double check that, and if I'm wrong, I'll have to make an addendum later, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. It's very good overall. I mean, it halves the damage that you're actually going to take once you take damage, which is a pretty good ability. It's a really decent one to stack if you already have good protection and maybe you want to get regeneration, as it can like reduce the damage you take per turn to a more manageable level. So some other ability like regeneration can stabilize your units, right? So it's pretty handy for those purposes. I'm not quite as much of a fan of it as I am of regeneration and awe, but it's still good. Okay, so that covers this part of the bless video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know in the comments if you noticed any horrible mistakes, or if you got any extra questions or comments, and hopefully I'll get a new video out soon with the next part.